Good morning, I'm Mandy Larkin, the Associate Curator of Public Programs at the Amerind Museum, and welcome to Consumption Earth, Art in the Anthropocene Age with Artist Neal Galloway. Before we begin the program today, I want to acknowledge that Amerind is located in southeastern Arizona, on lands where the O'odham, Hopi, Oshwe, and Apache families lived for untold generations, and whose wisdom and traditions live on today in vibrant communities. We are grateful for what all these communities, rich in history, have to teach us. Thank you to our members and donors who enable Amerind to provide free online programming and fulfill Amerind's mission to promote the knowledge and understanding of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, education, conservation, and community engagement. To learn how you can assist Amerind in supporting its mission and programs by becoming a member or donor, please visit amerind.org. And as a reminder, the Amerind Museum is open with safety protocols in place, such as requiring the use of masks and social distancing. To plan your trip to Amerind, go to the visit section of our website, amerind.org. And on Saturday, August 14th at 11 a.m. Arizona time, Amerind will host the free online lecture, Dene Resistance in the Archives, reading Milton Snow's photographs post-Navajo livestock reduction through the 1930s and 50s with Jennifer Nez Dennett-Dale. Visit the events section of Amerind's Facebook page or website for registration details. Then on Saturday, August 21st at 11 a.m., Amerind will host the free online gallery talk, Hummingbirds and Desert Flowers, Becoming Attractions with Dr. John P. Schaefer. Again, visit the events section of Amerind's Facebook page or website for registration details. Okay, so Artist Neal Galloway is an educator from Flagstaff, Arizona, who serves as a foundations lecturer in the School of Art at Northern Arizona University. He holds an MFA in 3D and Extended Media from the University of Arizona and a BA in Art and Music from the University of Tulsa. Galloway has been teaching college-level art courses for more than a decade and has exhibited artwork at a wide range of venues across the United States. And I'm happy to share with our audience that Neal's work is featured in the multi-artist exhibit Parched that is currently on display at Amerind through January 16th, 2022. And if you'd like to ask any questions during the program today, please type your question in the Q&A chat box. We'll gather those questions to share with our speaker after the presentation. And we are also recording today's program, and a link to the video will be sent out to all of our Zoom registrants later today. And with that, I'd like to welcome you, Neal. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Annie, and thanks to the Amerind for having me. I'd love to jump right in, and I do have a slideshow I'd like to share with you all. And the first thing I want to touch on is the title of my artist talk, which, some of you may be familiar with this term, the Anthropocene, and some of you may not, but I find that it really fits well with the type of art that I make, and hopefully you'll see that throughout my artist talk. So if you haven't heard of this term, the Anthropocene epoch is an unofficial unit of geologic time used to describe the most recent period in Earth's history when human activity has started to have a really significant impact on planet's ecosystems. It's becoming more official, though, because in May of 2019, the Anthropocene Working Group, an interdisciplinary research group established in 2019 by the International Commission on Stratigraphy, which that sounds super nerdy, and I really love it. The organization that is responsible for delimiting Earth's epochs based on the strata in our Earth's crust, voted overwhelmingly that the Anthropocene should be treated as a formal unit of geologic measure. And phenomena associated with the Anthropocene include an order of magnitude increase in erosion and sediment transport, disturbed cycles of different elements in the atmosphere. Carbon is one of the biggest ones, but also nitrogen, phosphorus, and other metals are kind of being concentrated, moved, and expanded throughout the atmosphere. And lots of other effects that we see. The thing that I think is really interesting they mention is the proliferation and global dispersion of many new minerals and rocks, including concrete, fly ash, plastics, and the myriad of technofossils produced from these materials. The reason they came to this conclusion that it should be considered its own epoch is that these changes are expected to persist for millennia or longer, and we are really altering the trajectory of Earth's ecosystems with permanent effect. I'm really interested, and I think it's fair to say concerned about this, and so that tends to be what I make my art about. So I want to share with you really briefly before jumping straight into some images, my artist statement, which is just a way for me to organize my thoughts and communicate it, hopefully clearly, to any audiences who are looking at my work. So Earth's environment is ultimately shaped by consumption. My work seeks to address the normalcy of overconsumption and the perception of belongings by highlighting the relationship between nature and consumer practices. I make works that take into account the environmental impact of the materials themselves, and I explore these ideas through my own convictions, habits, possessions, and emotional response to nature. These works take a variety of forms, including sculptures, environmental works, installations, paintings, photographs, performances, and videos. For as many of my artworks as I can, I used recycled supplies. Through the reappropriation of discarded materials into art objects that reference the natural world, I explore our relationships to nature, waste, consumption, and our emotional connection to objects in the natural environment. So I've got a lot of different kinds of works to show you. Materially, it's all over the place, but I hope that by the end of the talk, you're convinced that it's unified by this central theme, by this concept. And so I'm going to talk about the work roughly chronologically, but as I tell a lot of my students, just because I start making one type of work doesn't mean that I stop making it in a different style, just like artists throughout history. So some of my earliest works in this vein were book carvings. So I found this huge cache of books that they were giving away for free at a used bookstore because they just could not sell them. And I thought it was really fascinating that they'd lost their value in terms of the information that was inside them, but the object was still really fascinating. So how did I bring value back to the object itself? So I experimented with a lot of different things, and one of the methods that I came to was this carving process. And very quickly I found that it resembled or could resemble topographic forms, so I really sort of pushed that. And so this one is called Canyon Book, and it's actually based on one of the side canyons off the Grand Canyon. And I currently live in Flagstaff, so that feels really close to home, but it wasn't at the time. It's in Arizona, it's in Tucson. But I took this canyon idea even further when one of my family members gifted me knowing that I made this kind of work, gifted me this 6-book series of, I think they were like classic novels, but again, it was like something that nobody was really reading, or they had multiple copies, and they had all the same covers. So I thought, okay, this needs to be one work. So I carved them so that they sort of were assembled and matched up into a 6-book canyon. And the process for these sculptures is, it's kind of time consuming, but I also find it relaxing. I'm cutting each of these pages individually with an X-Acto blade, or groups of layers together. So sometimes it'll be 2 or 3 pages. This one I got a color book, and I thought I really need to take advantage of this color that was interspersed, huge full-page photographs interspersed with text. And so the effect was fantastic. I was happy with the way this one turned out. And I experimented with gluing all the pages back together, the waste material in reverse order, and matching it up. So when you put this, you can close this book and put it on a shelf. It's kind of innocuous, but you can pull it back off and sort of are surprised with what you find on the inside. At least that's my hope. Just a couple of details of this one. For a long time, I wasn't really interested in what the books used to be, what their titles were. That was the whole point, for me anyway, was that the information had become so ubiquitous or obscure that it wasn't really useful anymore. But I got questions over and over again from audiences like, ooh, what is that book? Like, what was it? What's the title? And that was, I think, a response I couldn't ignore. So I started trying to incorporate that into some of my book cuttings. And this is one of those first works that I did that. And so the title of the book and then the name of the artwork, which I adopt into it, is called The Story of the plant kingdom, and I made it look a bit like a bug-eaten leaf. This one's rather delicate. I've got to be careful with this one, but I was happy with the way that it turned out and loved the juxtaposition. This is just, you know, what happens when you're working with found materials between the carving on the right side and then those like scientific illustrations on the inside cover. I thought that was really nice. This book, the Book of Popular Science 1929, which is both the title of the book and the title of the artwork that I adopted, ended up being a totally different kind of altered book because I was fascinated with the contents of this one. The Book of Popular Science was actually a series of periodicals in the early and through the mid like 19th century that were science-based, but they had all kinds of stuff. Like the chapters would cover things like wool production, you know, battleships, to eugenics and like diatoms in the ocean. It was such a dizzying array of things, and the juxtapositions, even without having altered this book, I thought were amazing. But I decided to alter this using the material from the book itself with only a few very small additions to make a series of poetic meditations. And I marked the major areas of intervention with these little tabs. So I did all sorts of stuff too. If you interact with the book, you'll come across very different kinds of experiences. So this one was a series of what I call redacted haikus. So the text is already there, but I just sort of bound it and redacted it in order to make a small poem. So the one that I featured here on this slide says, "Hopelessly diverse, content indefinitely, we shall know the strange." Another page that I thought was really interesting is that I found this passage somewhere else in the book that talked about, you know, folk histories of the Milky Way, and then linked those to sort of scientific astronomical discoveries. And remember, this book is all the way from 1929, so we've made a lot of observational insights about the cosmos since then. But it says, strange theories as to the nature of the Milky Way have been advanced at various times. Anacharus thought it might be due to the shadow of our globe. Aristotle thought that it was some kind of mist due to the exhalation vapors from the Earth. And just like, I didn't write that obviously, but I thought it was beautiful. So I took that out and took their map of the Milky Way, transplanted into the section on volcanoes. And now the viewer is invited to kind of enact the exhalation vapors from the Earth. And I've got just a really short video that I'd like to show you that is incomplete in terms, it doesn't show you every page, but just really quickly gives you a sense of what it's like to flip through this book. The best way I found to show videos is actually to make sure that the video stream right now works well is to stream these on YouTube. So I've tried to get past the ads. Sometimes YouTube fights with me. So we'll do our best here. Let's take a look. And there's no audio or very quiet audio. So if you don't hear anything, that's okay. Just a little taste of that book of popular science. And it's my hope that people interacting with this book, you know, you are as likely to get caught up in the original text as you are my art pieces. I was fascinated by the book itself, which is why I left so much of it intact. Another artwork series that I made, and materially it's totally different, was a series of 4 mug sculptures that I cast in bronze. And a little bit of a joke here, right? The best part of waking up. And this was actually about coffee production. I'm a big coffee fan myself. My friends and family will tell you I love good coffee. Definitely been accused of being a coffee snob in the past, but beyond just like drinking it and making really good coffee, I'm really interested in it as like a commodity and force in the world. Up until World War II, it was like the second heavily most traded commodity after oil, which is kind of hard to believe, but is true, and it still ranks in the top 7 or 8 most heavily traded commodities in the world. And there's a big imbalance when it comes to where the power, the economic power lies in coffee production. Due to the specifics of the way the crop works, big international conglomerates that have a lot of money can kind of stockpile the green dried coffee beans, which are a durable good, years when it's really abundant. And then whenever, you know, the farmers have had a very difficult year due to climate or some other kind of strife, and they need that higher price that normally they could expect from that, from the shortage, to make sure that their livelihoods are intact. These international conglomerates flood the market with all the cheap coffee they bought years and years ago. And so anyway, that causes all kinds of problems, and that's a vast oversimplification, but I was interested in focusing on some of the problems caused by this. And so one of them is the sort of the farming practices that they have to take up result in a lot of erosion. So this is my erosion mug. The next one is deforestation. I think one of my favorites, just because that texture ended up being so rich. And I was able to take these molds that were made from real tree bark, because sculpting that texture, such a detailed texture from scratch, is almost impossible. And the way that bronze is cast, you can make an original in plaster, or I'm sorry, in clay, and then make plaster molds of that, and then make duplicates. These particular sculptures were actually sculpted in wax originally, and I used a lost wax casting. So they're one-offs. You know, once the wax was gone, that was it. I got the one sculpture out of it. This one is violence. So I froze that wax while I was working it, dropped it on the floor, and it shattered into a million pieces. And then I assembled it back together so that the effect was that it resembled broken ceramic. But you know, as I said before, these are metal, they're bronze sculptures. And then finally, hunger. In my artist statement, I mentioned sculpture, but one of the other things I mentioned that my artwork takes the form of, it's installation. And if you're not familiar with installation, it's like a room-sized artwork or a series of artworks put together in some kind of arrangement. And just the expansive possibilities of that media really appealed to me. And this one is a really personal artwork, or was at the time, in a really uncomfortable way. But just to explain it a little bit, I actually cataloged all of my belongings painstakingly, recorded them all in this giant spreadsheet, and then started thinking about, like, how could I categorize these? And one of the things I thought about was like, okay, well, what are needs and what are wants? And so I made this really sort of forced and artificial bifurcation between those two, and wrote all of my wants on one wall and needs on the other wall. And you can kind of see, like, look at all of the names of all the objects that I own, and then also see the increased concentration of them. And, you know, this exercise is an interesting one. It definitely changed my thinking. But I also wasn't super draconian about what counted as a need or a want. I think you could be really strict about this and say food, water, clothing, but I don't think that's a really productive exercise. I think it's far more interesting and relevant to say, okay, well, what do I need as a modern human in today's world? You know, and like, what is my career? You know, and if I'm making artwork, you'll see that this is my needs wall, and I have something on here. It's a video camera. Like, that's certainly not a need in the, you know, hierarchy of needs sense, but something that I thought, oh, that makes sense as somebody who makes video artwork in today's world. So even with this looser definition, the difference between these walls became interesting. And you'll see an example later on where I've used data in this way, especially with my Floodlines artwork, which is currently on display at the Amerind. I'll talk about that here in a minute. Another artwork that I created for actually the same installation space was one that I called Out to Dry. So this was a big fishing net that was hung across the gallery space from the wall by hand-smithed steel hooks that were encrusted with sea salt, and then clipped to the net were 50 or more of these individual ceramic fish, right? It's kind of a precarious position for fish to be in, right? Not caught in the net, but really hung out to dry. And the inspiration for this piece was that, and let me go back to the installation shot. I'd read this news article about a population of a certain kind of fish called the jack mackerel, which are kind of all over the world's oceans, but were dwindling precariously. And they'd found basically like a big concentration of these fish in the Pacific Ocean, just off the coast of South America. And all of this big dispersed fleet of ships from all over the world that was basically headed to that last fishery to sort of mop them up, because that was the only place that they could still catch these fish in huge quantities. And it's not even a really important fish in terms of like people, at least in the United States and in Europe, don't eat it very often. In fact, they catch the fish and then it's ground up and fed to livestock. This piece, I want to be clear, like I don't actually care about the jack mackerel very much. I've lived in landlocked places most of my life, but I just thought that it was a really profound and disturbing metaphor for the way that we tend to deal with the natural world in general. So this net was hung in front of this large painting that I'd made for this piece, which was about 8 by 5 feet, probably the largest painting I've ever made of a fishing trawler of the type that was going to the to that last holdout, with a stormy sky behind it. In addition to installation, time-based artwork became a really important part of my practice as well. So whether these are videos or performance artworks, and I gotta say, like as a college student learning about art, I was so skeptical about video and performance artworks, because you hear in the news about all the bad stuff, but man, the good video artwork, good performance artwork can be really arresting and effective. And I don't know that mine is, but it became a way that felt important for me to make some work, to try to make some statements. So this piece, I'll talk about it after we watch the video. It's a short video, one of my earliest video pieces called Digging for the River. And if you've never watched a video artwork before, it's maybe just a slightly different experience, because not all of them are narrative, like you're not necessarily watching a story or a movie, a YouTube video. A lot of times these are non-narrative, so just watch the sequence of events, listen to the audio, and maybe just be sensitive to what kind of situation is being suggested and the emotions that it brings up in you. So have this queued up. Let's see if YouTube cooperates with me. So what I wanted to depict here was a sort of pseudo-archaeological excavation. This is the Rillito in Tucson, Arizona, which, you know, decades ago used to be a real flowing river, but now is just seasonal. Maybe during the monsoons will flow, sometimes really violently, but it's mostly just a sandy bed and a lot of trash that, you know, either gets thrown or washed down from upstream. And so this is you know, somebody or something, I guess, digging an impossible hole trying to find the river, and they find sand and trash, and they're sort of throwing it from side to side. This piece has definitely some conceptual parallels to the work that I did for Parched, of course, because it's also dealing with water issues. Another time-based piece that I want to talk about is an artwork that I did called The Great Eraser. And this was a performance installation artwork that was a little bit complex, but it consisted of a series of sconces hung on the wall, and those sconces were made from scrap steel that were smithed to specifically hold all of these different glass vials. And those glass vials were like found objects at thrift stores or on the side of the road, or there was a scientific glassware blowing lab at the university, and I was able to get some from them. And so those were hung on the wall. And then I also had a really large section of tree ring that I was able to obtain through a partnership with the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research down in Tucson, which I know a lot of attendees to this talk may be familiar with, that the science of dendrochronology was invented there at U of A. So I think that's just a super cool fact, but I was able to work with their office and get these very large section of a pine tree, over 400 years old, so very old object. And I mounted it to a table and marked off decade increments. So for this installation, which had all of those things, I would come in and do a performance on like a regular schedule, don these coveralls, and you know, I had on work boots and a toolbox full of tools, and I would meticulously sand off the outside edge of this table. So if you came in 2 weeks, this whole like really pretty, I call them a cookie, cookie of tree ring would get smaller and smaller and smaller until it just sort of disappeared into nothing. And then I would sweep up the dust, all the sawdust, and put it into one of these vials. And you know, it's a complicated piece and it's talking about a lot, but if I can reduce it down to its simplest form, I think there's this really interesting incongruity between the way that we talk about and admire the natural world and in the way that we treat it. Like those things coexist in our civilization. And, you know, we're sort of comfortable with that inconsistency. And I wanted people to see it a little bit more clearly. So that's what the Great Eraser was. He was this agent of destruction, but also reverence, and holding these things I called ashes in the vials. And so each of the vials held 10 years of the tree's life. And of course, it's utterly impossible to put it back the way that it was once it's been destroyed. And you could come back and see how much the tree ring had shrunk because I had an overhead camera view of it with the original diameter marked on the wall. I did a series of artworks following those pieces that was talking about the use of coal for electricity production in the United States. And the situation has changed dramatically, even from when I made this piece. At the time, I think burning coal for electricity production made up like 70% of the mix of electricity in the United States. And even now, which is, I don't know, 5 or 6 years later, it's way down. And by far the biggest is, the largest is natural gas, to my knowledge. Renewables are increasing dramatically, but renewable energy, solar and wind specifically, make up such a small percentage of our electricity mix. You could double it, and then double it again, and then still make up only a tiny percent. But anyway, I wanted to take a complex look at coal, the use of coal for electricity production, because it's one of the most problematic fossil fuels we have, but it's also afforded us our way of life, right? I wanted to acknowledge that. So I made this piece, which I called Soot Cenotaph. And I made a cairn, a balanced stack of rocks for this piece on a ellipse of broken mirror. And when you came down the ramp to the gallery, you were kind of presented with this view, which reflected the cairn in the glass. And a cenotaph, by the way, is a grave marker for somebody who isn't there. So I was trying to honor the people who lost their lives mining for this, you know, doing the dangerous job of mining this stuff to kind of afford us our way of life. So I've got the reference to to life and death in that double image. You know, and hopefully this is a nice and interesting sculpture as it stands, but if you get closer, you're rewarded with just these little details so that people would understand that it's coal, and I'm talking about electricity production with these little outlets that I carved into some of the pieces. And I liked these little pieces. They weren't all of them, but they were some of them. I thought, what would it be if I had a sculptural object that was just one of these? So I went a little crazy and did a bunch of them on a large lump that I called grounded power. And coal is really interesting substance. I think we rely on it super heavily, like I said, for electricity production, but not a lot of people, at least in modern times, have interacted with it very much. Don't know what it looks like. So just giving people in the same space with the material was important to me. Here is another one of, you can see this reference back to some of those book cuttings that I made. And I told you I was starting to incorporate the titles into the concept for the piece. And this is certainly one of those, maybe far more specific and less abstract. This one's called The Big Coal. It's a way more recent piece, but in the same coal series, where I carved the footprint of the largest open pit coal mine in the United States into a book by the same name, Big Coal, about the overwhelmingly outsized political influence of the coal industry on the United States government, which is waning, but still quite powerful. And here is another piece in that series, which I called Core Sample. This was a complex piece to build. And consists of a rammed earth column. So this is mostly dirt. It's got a very small amount of cement mixed in, but it's not like pourable. You have to compact it under pressure, and they make houses out of it. It's really fascinating, this rammed earth style. But I thought it would be interesting to kind of preserve, make this thing that referenced museum displays and vitrines with a little bell jar to kind of honor it, but also put it firmly in the past. And then I'm also, you know, interested in the strata that's suggested by calling this core sample, right? Like you drill a big hole and pull out a big plug of earth. And so it's a bit of a visual joke, I guess, on what that would look like if it came out looking just like this. And this gives me an opportunity, because I had photographs to show you of a little bit of my artistic process. And I'll talk about that a little bit later with my artworks in the Amerind right now associated with the Parts exhibition. But what I find is that I'm most productive when I come up with the idea first. Like some artists are media first, like they're painters, and they just love the feel of you know, the paint, so they'll just paint, which is wonderful. It's great. It's always the ideas that interest me first. So I'll get an idea through a sketch or something, and a lot of times I'll find a way to like see if it's even going to work, either through you know, using some drawing skills, or in this case I was using Photoshop just to mock up a quick and dirty version, just to see if it even you know, would look good. And so obviously this isn't what the final version looked like, but with some early visualization to help me see what this, you know, might appear to be. And I like the way that this turned out, because it confirmed for me that, yes, this is a really strange, weird object. I think it's going to make a good artwork. Let's go forward with it. And then some behind the scenes of actually constructing it. So I had to get these really large posts that I lathed in 2 pieces. They were quite big, and I'd never used a lathe before, so it was a learning curve. Hopefully I did okay. But I wanted these forms to be a little bit cacophonous, but also to flow into one another. Like that was a tension I was trying to get. And so after I made the posts, I had to make 2-part molds that would sustain the pressure of making the rammed earth. So that's what you're seeing in the bottom right-hand image, are the little rubber mold pieces that catch all the detail, and then the big plaster molds on the outside of that to give it some strength from the pressure. And as I clamped them together and then packed in that earth so that it stuck into its final form, and it resulted in the finished work you see here. I want to take just a little bit of an intermission to my artworks to talk a little bit about my influences. I had a version of this talk where I put these at the beginning, but I think they make a lot more sense once you've seen my works. So these are some artists, and certainly not all, but just a small few whose careers I followed, or you know, I've heard speak, or I've read their writings, whose ideas or artworks has really impacted the way that I make things. One of those artists is a guy named Mark Dion, and he makes works that have an environmental bent for sure, but he's really interested in the way that we categorize the natural world. So he's looking at institutions that do that, so like scientific processes and museums. And so this one, I mean, it's really direct. He's got a lot of other pieces that are more subtle, but I like this one because it's really interesting. He's made what looks like a museum vitrine that you'd see at a natural history museum, showing, you know, like the like a wolverine in its natural habitat. But what he's highlighted here is the unique ecosystems that humans have created from their waste. So he's kind of highlighting all the animals that live at the landfill, and that's the name of this piece, is landfill. So he's got, you know, stuffed seagulls and wild dogs and coyotes and cockroaches and things inside this vitrine, showing you the wildlife. Another artist who also deals with environmental and ecological issues, but I would say from a totally different angle, is an artist named Andy Goldsworthy. And he almost exclusively uses natural materials, so rocks, sticks, trees, mud, snow, ice, that kind of thing. And I think it's fair to say that he's more philosophical about it. Like, he's interested in the way that humans interact with the natural world, but also the kinds of different time frames that like nature and human lifetimes are operating within. Also, you know, certainly talking about life and death. And so this one is his Storm King wall, which is a dry stone wall, which instead of obviously shooting straight through these trees or maybe even killing the trees to get through it, it goes out of its way to make a serpentine path. And I think one of my favorite details about this is it even goes down into the water of this small pond and comes back out the other side and just keeps going up the hillside. I think that's really interesting. So it's really difficult to encapsulate these artists in one image. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I just thought I'd give you the taste. Nam June Paik is another artist who, you know, I think has been really influential to me and often considered one of the founders of video art. His video, you know, installations and video artworks are really smart, sometimes funny, and have totally different aesthetics. But this one is his TV Buddha, and he's encapsulated past, present, and future all in one image because he's got the video camera pointed at the Buddha and the TV is on a time delay. So we've got the Buddha statue in the present watching his past version from the TV, and the one in the TV is watching its future self out in the real world since it's on the time delay. And that kind of really big statement for such a simple and exposed mechanism is fascinating to me. Alfredo Jarre is another artist whose work I find really fascinating a lot, because you couldn't see one work by Alfredo Jarre and another and like understand just by looking at them that they're the same artist necessarily, because he's also interested in this idea first approach. And so if he needs to make work out of a giant, you know, building, he's going to do that. You know, sometimes he may take you know, thousands of photographic negatives and display them on a lighted table. This piece I thought was really fascinating. He was trying to draw attention to the homeless population in Montreal, Canada, without really exploiting that group. So he put these big red lights in the cupola of one of the city's buildings and linked that to a button in one of the homeless shelters so that any of the men and women in there could press the button and make themselves known by lighting up, you know, this city hall building without, you know, breaching their anonymity, for instance. So I thought that was a really sensitive way of doing it. And I heard him speak once, but just the way that he approaches work, idea first, and also just be really informed about the world. I thought that was a really powerful suggestion from Alfredo Jarre. Like, read news from a ton of different sources in a lot of different countries if you can, because it will give you an idea of, you know, you can never find the truth, but maybe it gets you a little bit closer and at least understand the viewpoints that people are coming from. And the last influence I want to talk about is an architect. Alfredo Jarre is an architect. Bruce Goff is an architect. After following college, I did this internship where I was cataloging his huge collection of records, but I did a lot of reading and research on Bruce Goff, who is a fascinating architect, worked mostly in the Midwestern United States, like Oklahoma, Texas, but he's got all over the country, but those were most of his buildings were. And the two things that I really pulled away from reading and learning about Bruce Goff is he was a shameless material experimenter. Like, he would use all sorts of random things, which seem bizarre, but he was interested in what that might do for his artwork. So whether that was putting glass cullets, scrap chunks of glass, which made these glowing orbs inside the walls, or making this experimental, spiral roof. And the other thing that he talked about a lot in relation to both art and music is kind of not to trust your first impression of something, especially if that impression is negative. He used his example of his first experience with the composer Debussy, that he just really didn't like the record that he had bought, and he stuck with it, and Debussy became one of his favorite composers. And I thought that that was just a smart way of thinking about the world, and I try to do that myself. So, which leads me to my last part of my artist talk. And I want to talk about the works that are currently on display at the Amerind as part of the Parks, the Art of Water in the Southwest exhibition, which was originally installed at the Coconino Center for the Arts, which is now on display at the Amerind. While it was at the Coconino Center for the Arts, the steering committee, commissioned a documentary to be made because of COVID, and not a lot of people could see it. And the documentary is incredible. So I think Nick Gieb did a fantastic job. And for that reason, I'm stealing a bit of it, because I think he explains, or through his editing, against me talking about the work, he explains it very well. So let's watch this short excerpt. Again, I have it queued up. Let's see if YouTube will cooperate with me. So I think I'll start with my piece, Groundwater, which is a fountain, like a fiberglass fountain. The fountain, instead of flowing with water, the idea is that this is flowing with sand instead.
Neil, I think when you muted yourself, you also muted the audio on your video.
I'm sorry, Annie, can you say that again?
When you muted your microphone, you also muted the audio from your video.
Oh, so sorry. Let's jump back a little bit. Here we go. Thank you. The fountain, instead of flowing with water, the idea is that this is flowing with sand instead. Because I'm hoping that people connect with all of their emotional connotations that they have with water, how they find it relaxing and comforting. And then I love the way that sand contrasts that. It's a little, you can taste it in your mouth when it moves around, and it doesn't sound the same. The title Groundwater is a bit of a pun, right? But there's also a little bit more of a direct reference to some of the stuff that we learned in the boot camp. A lot of laws and traditions around water in Arizona are really strange, really backwards. And one of them is this weird bifurcation we have in our laws between the way that groundwater is managed and the way that surface water is managed. That's one of the things that I kept coming back to as so counter to even not even modern understandings, but we've known that for a while, that groundwater and surface water are linked, but we treat them as totally separate entities, and that causes a lot of conflict. And so I wanted to speak to that conflict a little bit. Floodlines is a piece which is a installation in the gallery here at the Coconino Center for the Arts. And early on, I started envisioning what would it look like or feel like if we filled up the space so that it filled up with water. And so this piece, Floodlines, marks a series of lines on the wall inside the gallery at different heights. And the idea is that those mark different levels of water that would fill up the volume of the space. And the difference between those lines is that they reference different dollar amount, the purchase amount of water. So every line is $100 of water. But the reason they're different is because you can buy them at different rates. So $100 worth of water from the Central Arizona Project
to be used for agriculture, you can fill this gallery space up to within a foot of the ceiling. But if, say, for instance, you're hauling water onto your rural property on the Navajo or Hopi reservation, you can maybe stand in an inch of water. Like, it might get the bottom of your feet wet. I mean, embedded in the difference between these lines is a pretty deep inequity. One of the implications of the piece is seeing that inequity and feeling that inequity. And that price affects the way that you use it, like how careful you are with it. And I don't blame anybody for that relationship. Like that's one that we all have. I'm arguing that our world is really profoundly impacted by the way that humans, like the way that we're impacting it through the things that we consume, and then ultimately throw away or discard. And that word consumption, parched, is particularly apt for the way that we deal with water. Like that's really the way that we think about water. Water should be more expensive. It needs to be costlier, especially for those industries that use it most heavily. Agriculture is the #1 user of water in the state of Arizona because it's so cheap and our laws are so loose. So there's no incentive to be conservative with it, and that's causing some really severe problems. So water.
So I encourage you guys to check out the whole documentary. It's really fascinating, and I was honored to be a part of that. But hopefully that gave you a little bit of a taste of the 2 pieces that I made for that exhibition, which you can go see yourselves at the Amerind. And because I showed the finished work in that, I thought you all might be interested in seeing some of the behind the scenes process of like how these works came to be. At least I find that interesting when I found out about other artists. So maybe that's an assumption I've made, but at any rate, most of my work in my sketchbook ended up being tons and tons of writing, just research and different things. But one of my earliest conceptions of that piece, which actually ended up looking a lot like this drawing, ended up looking a lot closer to the finished work than some of my other pieces do. But this early version I was almost thinking about as a wishing well. And so you can see like references in my notes here about like putting in screens to prevent like coins from getting like sucked up into the mechanism. And so now I have the idea, and now I have to figure out how to make it work. And I had a very general idea that I wanted a screw auger inside a pipe to elevate the sand. I know they use a very large version of that in agriculture to move grains and things like that. I didn't know if it could work to move the material that I was using. And so I made this proof of concept with a popcorn bucket and a drill below. And it worked. I was really thrilled that it worked. So I knew if it worked on a small scale, it was just a matter of time and technology to get it to work on a larger scale. But man, what a struggle and process. So I realized early on I needed like a port in the bottom to put a lot of the mechanics for this artwork. And it took me 2 days just to figure out how to cut that panel that you see on the left-hand side of the image here, so that it could be reassembled in a way that was subtle. And then the sand was all different grain sizes. So being able to sift it to make it more consistent so that it didn't gum up the mechanism, I used this really bodged together contraption from a ladder and a rope and some window screen, things like that. So this is all like the messy stuff behind the scenes that I find really interesting, so hope you do too. This was me just drawing and trying to figure out how the heck I could make this mechanism work and then fit inside the limited space that I had. And I had never made a motorized kinetic work before, so that was a huge challenge for me. I think if I had a background in engineering or something, this may have been a lot easier process, but I was learning a lot of things from scratch, electronics and motors and gear ratios and things. So I had to educate myself rather quickly. And so this is a troubleshooting day. I think it's really fun to see this. Like the fountain's kind of together, I've got sand in it, but just my stuff is everywhere. And after all of that work, you do get a final piece that's cleaned up, all the tools are put away, the port is gone, and you just get the work in the space. And we've paired it in the Amerind with a video so that you can see that motion. The other artwork that I made for the Parched exhibition was floodlines, and the process for that one looked very, very different because I didn't really sketch about it. I had this idea of making these different water levels, but the raw material, instead of like sketching and paint, ended up being data and formulas and blueprints for the space. And so I thought I'd give you a little bit of a window into what that looked like, at least for me. And so I had to brush up on my algebra and write a formula that you can see highlighted in my upper left-hand image here that tells me I can change this dollar amount and that will proportionally change this number, which tells me the height up the wall based on the volume of the space. So I was able to use this same formula, but change the area, you know, the numbers for the area for the Coconino Center for the Arts, and then for the Amerind. So it's in a much smaller space at the Amerind, but the relationships are the same. And what you will see in the Amerind is $10 of water versus $100 of water. But I really encourage you, if you can, to go see it in the space. I'm going to come back to these in a minute, just because you can kind of look around the room and your eye line will, in your peripheral vision, will like line up with these lines, and you can really feel what it might be like to have that water rising up around you. And just some more of the background work that maybe people don't think about is it was several days of graphic designing to figure out how to make these labels. I wanted them to look like flood markers, you know, high water marks from historic floods, you know, like in 1859, the water got this high. And so I experimented with all sorts of things. I almost hand routed them all, and eventually came to this photo transfer process. So I you know, spent a lot of time. Luckily, I know a little bit about graphic design, so I was able to graphic design these, printed them out in reverse on a laser printer, and went through the process of making these into something that I think looks professional and has the aesthetic that I wanted. It took so much experimentation just to figure out what kinds of marks to get on the wall. So I was using a spray bottle and dripping, and then like taping things off. And eventually, and I have to give big thanks to the curator of the show, Julie Komnick, my friend and an incredible artist in her own right, who did the painting on the walls. So that we can get the proper like drippy sort of stained effect. And right, it really is bridging the gap between something that's pretty and something that's kind of ugly, you know, and that's sort of the point. So anyway, back to my finished images here. And like I like in the right-hand image where it's starting to interface with the architecture of the building. That's the whole point, that's being flooded. So going over that vent, for whatever reason, I really like that part. And I know I will have questions about what I'm working on now or future projects, so I thought I'd end with 2 really short slides, and then I would love to take your questions. There's a possibility that I may be able to install a version of Floodlines in the Science Annex at NAU. They're redoing that space, and I've had a request to do that. So who knows that will if that will happen, but that's a proposal I'm working on. And then for the last 2 years, I haven't had a studio space, which has really put a damper on my ability to make work. The Coconino Center for the Arts was kind enough to loan me kind of a garage space, which is where I made the groundwater piece. And the Floodlines piece, but I've been working, a lot of my creative energy has gone into building, designing a studio. So I have a guy here in Flagstaff named Ed Dunn helping me with that, and I'm gonna super insulate it, put solar panels on it, and the south facing version has a trom wall, so I'm hoping to heat the space with passive solar energy. So that's been where a lot of my energy has gone. Hopefully you guys find that interesting, but anyway, that's all I have for you today. I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank the Amerind for hosting me, and I'd be pleased to take any questions that you guys have.
Thank you so much, Neal. Where can we, beyond Parched, the exhibit Parched, where else can we see your work on display? Yeah, so I don't have anything else physical on display at the moment. So Parched is your best bet. But if you're curious and you want to see some work both featured in this presentation and not, you can go to my website, nealgalloway.com. And you know, a few times a month, I also try to post on my Facebook artist page. So if you're curious following me, you can go to facebook.com/Artist Neal Galloway, and that's a good way to find out about future exhibitions too. And our next question is from Julie. She says, "Thank you for your insightful presentation. She appreciates your use of reclaimed materials and seeing that many of your works are contemporary. Can you briefly talk about how this pertains to your concerns with the Anthropocene epoch?" Let me see if I can answer that question. I think so. I'm not a scientist, so I could be misspeaking here. But you know, whenever we look at the Anthropocene as an epoch, it's supposed to be like a disinterested look at how we categorize the natural world and and geologic time. But implied in that is like this great movement of and change of the earth, and that tends to be more negative than positive. And it's also sort of accomplished through this complex web of systems that hides our
everyday life, like the consumption of everything, the energy in our house, you know, books, our clothes, our toys, from where those materials come from. Like, we don't really have that connection because those things are so complex. And then we also have really complex systems for hiding that material from ourselves whenever it goes away. Like, we put them into these bins, and like big trucks come and they're totally enclosed, and they smush them down, and then they take them to the special location far away from civilization and then bury them. So I just think bringing attention to these connections can help people maybe lighten their load on the earth and understand both the individual impact, but also like the way that systems have an oversized role. Like, frankly, I don't think we're going to save the world through individual action. I think individual action is important, but it's going to take systematic action to make any meaningful change to kind of slow down the damage. So I don't know that I've answered the question, but hopefully touched on it a little bit about where I'm coming from in terms of my artwork and its link to the Anthropocene epoch.
And how do you decide what topic to examine in your work, or topics?
Sometimes it's just an article I've read that's stuck in my brain. I'll collect these or write about them in my sketchbook, and then I'll go back through the sketchbooks and mine them. So it's usually the things I can't get out of my head. Like, I'll have an idea, I'll read an article, and if I like wake up thinking about it 3 weeks later, the art making the work is how I get it out. Like, how I stop thinking about it. That's usually a pretty good sign. So I know that's a bit of an intuitive process in that regard. And sometimes it's outside collaboration or something that's happening in the world. So for like the Parched exhibition, I made work about water scarcity in the Southwest, not necessarily because that is what was on my mind at the moment, although you can see some of that reflected in my previous works, but because I was invited to participate, and so I was very happy to direct my work that way for that particular project.
And is there a media that you have yet to explore that you're hoping to do so in the near future?
Oh, always. Yeah. You can see them all over the place materially. And that, I like that because it means I can use whatever media is best to do the idea. But to be frank, it's a really inefficient way of working because I have to relearn a new media every time. And I can't work at the same level of somebody who's worked with that material over and over again. So it's a huge struggle and very time consuming to bring them up to a professional level than if I was working with something that I was more familiar with. And I mean, I guess it would depend on the idea. So I'm always out there curious, looking at materials and artworks. One of the, I think it's fair to say, one of the holes in my knowledge is you saw a little bit of ceramic with like those ceramic fish, but ceramics is, and working with clay is something that's really powerful and very plastic. So that's something I'd love to learn a little bit more about. I do some metal working, like you saw some blacksmithing and stuff, and that's something that I really, if there is a media I can pick that I just enjoy for the sake of doing it, it might be blacksmithing. So doing more of that, I think, in my work is probably inevitable too.
And regarding your altered books, how long does it take to create something like Plant Kingdom that has that incredible detail?
Good question. It's been a while since I've created that work, and it really does depend. I think the most time-consuming work was the color topo because the pages were really thick. I could only cut them like 1 or 2 at a time versus 2 to 3 or 4, depending on the thickness of the paper. So it took a lot longer to get through, and then adhering them together and lining all those little sections up perfectly took forever. I think that one was, 20, 30 hours. The story of the Plant Kingdom, because there was no re-adhering, was actually a little less time-consuming, but my best guess would be maybe like 12 hours, something like that.
Well, it's just been a fascinating hour to see your work, Neal. It's just been an incredible journey for all of us. Thank you so much for your time today. Yeah,
no problem. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share my work, and hope the viewers liked it. And I encourage you, not just because my pieces are there, but because there's some incredible other artworks right now at the Amerind at the Parched exhibition that I think if you're available, you should go check them out. Anyway, thank you guys so much.
And I agree. And Parched, again, is on display until January 16th of 2022. So you have plenty of time to go down and explore that wonderful exhibit. And as a reminder to all of our guests, we will be sending out a link to the video later today, so you can go back and examine some of his work once again. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Neal. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.